Love can be exhilarating and wonderful, but it can also be painful and complicated. Join clinical psychologist and best-selling author Dr. David Hawkins as he reveals the truth about the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of relationships. Listen in as he gives you practical tips for hope and healing. Welcome to the podcast, Mad in Love.
Welcome to another podcast of Mad in Love, where we discuss all things narcissism, all things emotional abuse, all things covert and overt emotional abuse. I'm Dr. David Hawkins, and we are really excited today to have in our studio, sort of a studio, a great friend of mine, colleague, and coach extraordinaire, Lee Kaufman. Lee, welcome, where we're going to talk today about financial abuse, an integral part, often an aspect that's interwoven into the broader issue of emotional abuse. Welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And this is something that we deal with a lot, and it's often a symptom of unhealthy relationships. And it's nice to be able to tackle one topic where we can look at that and sort of extrapolate out some of the larger problems that people typically face.
Just kind of a lead into this, I have heard it said that we are more comfortable talking about sex, anything, death, sex, death, taxes, anything, not money. That money is the I don't know. It's just like it's taboo. It's not okay to even. In fact, I mean, I rarely ask couples what is happening financially in your relationship. Do you agree that there's something even about the topic of finances that is already emotion laden?
I'm probably the wrong one to ask that of, because I went to university, I studied economics, and I worked in finance, and so. Because I actually have a little of awareness of what that thing is and apply it to my own budget and in my relationships, I think I naturally use it as a communication tool. But if somebody didn't have all of that background and decades of talking about money as a part of their life, and they never had education around it, I think it's a very difficult topic to talk about. And the same, like you said, with sex or parenting, if we didn't have it as a part of our upbringing, it just wouldn't naturally be conferred in our DNA. And so we're talking mostly about people who didn't get a chance to build healthy relationships with money, and now they're together.
Now they're together.
So,
a related question is this. So I've also, it's a cliche that in the therapy world, the counseling world, that one's sexual relationship is a barometer of how things are going. And I think that's there's some truth to that. So that is something that I ask most couples about. Do you think there's some similarity? Do you think if we were to ever approach a couple and say, hey, how are you guys with finances? How is that an area of comfort for both of you? And is there a sense of equality? And then watching them as they answer the question, do you think that would be a barometer for what might be happening in this relationship?
I do. And last year or the year before, I did a little research on how much better off married couples are than singular people in accruing wealth, how they do financially. And it's significant. I think it was $17,000 a year more on average. And the reason was that there's alignment, that both parties are focused. There's obviously the comparative advantage if you're only paying one homeowner's insurance as opposed to two and things like that. But the other piece is that you're in agreement on how you actually spend your money. So marriage and money can go really, really well together if people are aligned, and they can go horribly wrong if people aren't aligned. And really what we're talking about is what happens when they're not aligned.
Yeah, so again, I said in the introduction that we at the Marriage Recovery Center, we have a specialty: narcissistic abuse, emotional abuse, and so on. And those waters run very, very deep, and it's such a complicated topic. But set the stage here for us. This podcast is financial abuse. Like, drum roll, that already, financial abuse. In a way, it seems like the words shouldn't go together. What do you mean? Hold it. We can hit our partner. We can yell at our partner. We can stomp out of the room with our mate and not talk to them for 3 days. We can call them names. I wouldn't have so quickly put the words financial abuse together, and yet I think they can go together. So set the stage for us. What is this thing called financial abuse? And I'm sure those listening to this are going to nod their heads and go, or maybe they don't even recognize it in their relationship now. But as you share about what this thing is, what is financial abuse, I think some eyes are going to be widened in the process.
I think we all have examples of what couples have done in an unhealthy way, and maybe giving a few examples could help. I worked with a couple, and they even came to work with me in person, so we knew each other quite well after an intensive. When they fought, the husband would move money from their joint checking account to an account that she didn't have access to. And then she would have to heal the wound of their fight in order to have access to the money that's rightfully hers and was for things like groceries and utilities and gasoline for the car. And I think that's a really glaring example of how it's incredibly wrong of him to do that, and it's difficult to navigate, and having help in that regard is probably the right thing to do. Another example was a woman did something against her husband's wishes. She took her children to go visit their aunt and their cousins, and he told her that she couldn't do it. After that trip, he discontinued her credit card, and that was the credit card that she used to meet with me for counseling. So he basically took away her lifeline to help in the mental health world, and in being able to pay for anything, she now is beholden unto him. These are glaring examples. It's very hard to imagine anybody would say that this is an appropriate response or okay in any relationship whatsoever. And so I think we're probably all in agreement that these are completely wrong, controlling, and manipulative. And then there are much more subtle examples where maybe one person overspends on clothing and they have a compulsion, and their mate stops the credit card because they're running up debt. That's a much more subtle example where it's not exactly clear what's going on, that someone is abusing the other person, but it's clear that they're not aligned. And I think the ones where they're not aligned are the ones where I think we can be much more helpful.
I want to talk about another aspect of this, Lee, and that is, as you were telling these different stories, I was imagining what would happen in a financially abusive relationship. What happened when the woman, let's say, went to her husband and said, hey, wait a second, not okay. This is not okay, which you can imagine someone doing.
Sure.
It's at that intersection, I'm imagining what I call crazy making and chaos and abuse, multiple layers of abuse. What would you imagine in that situation where we all agree he acts inappropriately? Mm-hmm. She then goes to him appropriately and says, wait a second, this is not okay. What would you, in a financially abusive relationship, what would then happen?
Well, this is something you and I were talking about offline recently. In a healthy couple, if the partner goes and talks to their mate and says, I'm uncomfortable with this, I'd like us to talk about it and work through it, healthy couples would then have a dialogue. And even if they weren't exactly on the same page, they would be able to talk with each other, open up the topic completely, and come to some greater understandings. What we often see, though, in much more what we might refer to as abusive or controlling relationships, is then the partner layers it on even heavier. Mm-hmm. You don't even know how to manage money. So I'm taking away your access to money, and it's actually the right move to do because you've never shown any ability to manage money effectively. So rather than
doubling
that's
down,
the moment where the abuse,
shifting the blame.
That's the moment where the abuse becomes very, very clear.
I think this is obvious to you and I, but it may not be obvious to folks listening. What's a healthy response? I always like to think about that, and I like to say that to the couples I'm working with. He does something inappropriate, and she is shocked and says, not okay. If he was a healthy individual, what should he have said in response to her consternation?
Sometimes I think about this. It's easy sometimes to use business examples because a lot of our clients have jobs and are professionals, and think about what they would do in the office place. If we have a firm and we're partners in that firm, and one partner goes to another partner and says, I'm really uncomfortable with the way that you're managing our finances, the appropriate and thoughtful response would be, gosh, we're really in it together. I want you to be comfortable. How can we find a middle path so that we both are at ease with the way that we're running our business? Because I think about a household as an economy. Of course, there are the emotional and the romantic pieces to it, but there's also income coming in and expenses going out. And those things, just like in any other business, need to be managed in a way that the partners agree. And most of our clients in the office place with their business partners would be very reasonable. And so that's a litmus test that we can use. What would a reasonable person do here if it was in your job?
I want to highlight that. Would you just say it again? Because that's a tool. I like it when I hear, oh, that's a tool. That's okay. I can put that on my tool belt. Just say it again. What's this? This is for everybody listening, and you want to put a yellow highlighter on this one. What you're listening to? Say it again, Lee.
I often say to people, your most important business partnership in your life is going to be with your mate. And so you want it to be a healthy partnership where you do all of the things the way that you would do in any other business relationship, if not better. So that's the litmus test. What would healthy people do in running an organization, whether it's a household or a nonprofit or Apple Computer? What would a healthy person do?
That is really, really good. I know you pretty well, and so I'm imagining this is just kind of common sense to you. This is the way you run your life. It's the way you run all your relationships and your life. By the way, for anybody who might know Lee Kaufman, his life is stable and healthy, and I mean, by and large, you've got a quirk or two, but by and large, you live by this what you're sharing with us right now. So. Yeah, what would a healthy organization do? What would happen at a healthy workplace? Because you are in business with your mate.
Yeah, and we've got lots of public examples of Bernie Madoff kinds of situations where somebody is doing something very unhealthy. And ultimately, when something like that is happening, you end up having to pay the piper, whether it's through conflict and potential, in a lot of our client base, autoimmune diseases because of the stress that goes on chronically. But eventually, you have to pay somehow if somebody's doing something untoward.
So, Lee, again, just to clarify for listeners, when does it become abuse? When do we use that word that makes so many people uncomfortable? Like, really? We're going to use the abuse word? Where is the line, would you say, that says that, no, this is not just a misunderstanding. This is not just communication problems. This is not just the ups and downs that any married couple is going to experience. It's just, it's just a struggle. We'll work out the kinks. When is it? When do you raise your eyebrows and go, no, this is something bigger, deeper, more severe?
And this is maybe where it differs from a business, because the emotions run much higher in intimate romantic relationships, marriages. I think it begins when somebody feels scared, nervous, untrusting that their partner is doing something on their behalf to look out for the well-being and the interests of the family. And at that point, the response in a healthy couple should be, "Oh my gosh, darling, I didn't know that you were feeling this way. I would love to talk about this with you, and we'll make any necessary changes if it's something that's important for you to feel more comfortable." That's what a healthy couple sounds like. I had no idea you were feeling this. If it's important to you, it's important to me. Let's make time to address it together and figure out how we can solve this.
I love that. So, keep going, please. What would the symptoms be? And by the way, I often say this, Lee. I often tell couples or women that I'm working with that have been emotionally and narcissistically abused, this is often felt more quickly than it is seen, though it is important at some point to see it so you can name it and go, okay, that's what's going on. That's why I'm feeling the way I feel. Say it again. You listed some symptoms, but I would like to just highlight those again.
I want to use a different way to describe it. We often, in the work with clients, use a lot of different tools. And one of the tools that we use around communication is called nonviolent communication. And nonviolent communication is a methodology that's geared more at building connection than being right. And we recognize a lot of our language has become litigious. When couples argue, they're often arguing over data points, and they're forgetting that their desire is to be connected. So I think what the symptom really is a sense of being disconnected, ultimately. And if somebody in their response to that says, gosh, what I want more than anything is to be connected with you, that pathway is open and healthy and likely to provide healing. If in that moment the response is litigious and combative, where somebody's arguing the data points, I'm running the money, I understand how to handle finances, I do it for a living, stop giving me crap. That's a clear example of somebody who's not seeking to deepen connection and is being defensive. So that's where we would dig in with our clients and try to, in that very moment, figure out, why not connection? Why wouldn't you seek connection when you have the opportunity?
Why don't you answer that question? We can't really get into the mind of Well, actually, we can.
We can.
We do that. Yeah. Speak to that.
We can approximate it for a whole host of different reasons, but you're right. We can never know exactly. One really simple, straightforward reason could be that that person has not been well physically. I was talking to somebody recently whose husband has an autoimmune illness that they have not been able to figure out. And he's tired all of the time. He's unable to participate in the family at a high level. And their marriage is under strain. It's not anybody's fault, but it's clearly causing problems. So physical illness, ailment, lack of being 100% can sometimes do that. Mental illness, while we don't always like to address it directly and straightforwardly in our culture, if somebody has a specific mental illness where they're quote unquote not in their right mind, they may not be responding as if a reasonable person would. Could be manic, could be bipolar, it could be NPD, narcissist. They wouldn't necessarily respond as a reasonable person would, and so that could be a reason why somebody wouldn't choose connection over conflict. Those are really simple examples. And one other that I think we encounter a lot, which is early childhood trauma, sometimes causes somebody to lash out and to dig in and to be protective, even amongst the people that you would think they would be the most open to. And so we need to check in and see, is this just a reaction? And if we can outlast it, can that person decompress and regulate and then be open to a better and healthier dialogue? Or are they just checked out, in which case we probably need to pause. And if you're their spouse, you probably need to get yourself safe.
So I want to hearken back to what you said about a healthy person. So a healthy person, the healthy response is, oh my goodness, I had no idea that you're feeling this way. And now my eyes are open. I'm aware. I want to hear what you have to say. I would never want you to feel threatened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is not what the audiences that are listening to this podcast likely have experienced. They have likely, and I want to explore this a little bit, Lee. They're likely to confront their mate, and their mate, as you illustrated, doubles down, gets defensive, and is protecting something. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. So the man, I'll pick the gender, men. It's 90% men typically when we talk about emotional abuse. So I'm going to use men and women in that regard. It's not always the case, of course. But the woman confronts the man, and the man, what would you imagine this man is feeling that would prompt him to defend himself so vigorously? So, I mean, kind of in a black and white way, but we're going to talk about this being a symptom of a larger issue. But what would you imagine if that man could say, here's what's going on for me? What might he say? Why is he doubling down and going, yeah, you know what? You don't handle money very well anyway. I know how to handle money. And, anyway, this incredible force field coming at her. And then she gets frustrated, backs down, and then the problem continues and continues and continues. What if he could share from a healthy way? What do you imagine is going on in his mind?
And I think, to reiterate what you've said, there's no excuse for it. Like, we're not making excuses for the behavior. We're just trying to be understanding, because as people who try to help people, being understanding is kind of rule number one to be able to connect with somebody and potentially continue the conversation. We would think it would be more sophisticated than the things that it typically is, but it often isn't. I find that mostly it's fear. And it can be fear about a variety of things. Could be fear if a person grew up in a very, very low income environment and didn't have very much and were always moving about between places or living in a car, and there's this feeling that no matter how much we have, it all could fall apart quickly, they may behave in ways that we would term abusive, but they would justify it by saying, I need to keep a roof over our heads.
Yeah.
I need to be able to have enough to be able to provide. Right? Fear is often the driving force for bad behavior.
I want to camp here. So I sometimes, I don't know if you would call it coming to the defense of the abusive man, and I don't want to be misunderstood here.
Sure.
That we hold these men accountable for change as much as we can. But to your point, I mean, and imagine how odd it would sound. This woman confronts the man, and we're going back now to what does a healthy man say when he's afraid? Mm-hmm. A healthy man says, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid. Yeah. Honey, I know I know this is not, I'm not behaving well here in this situation. I did cut off, I stopped the credit card because you had spent a certain amount of money, but this is on me. I'm afraid and I behaved badly and I am sorry. And I'm going to get some help for this fear that I have. I'm going to talk it out. I'm going to think it out. I'm going to go to Lee Kaufman, who will help me work it out. But that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen, at least not for a while, not without some help to mature, to grow, to learn nonviolent communication, which you and I both love. But that,
sure.
But nonviolent communication, for those, a quick little ditty on that is, that's making clear observations. That's sharing feelings and being comfortable sharing feelings. That is sharing what a deeper need is inside of us, and that's making requests. The threatened man, I want to just go back to that, Lee, if you could speak to that. The threatened man, the fearful man, and the man who's not conversant with his feelings, doesn't know how to make requests. There's going to be some gasps when I say this. He doesn't know how to assert himself. That's a whole nother podcast, because some listening are going, are you kidding me, Dr. Hawkins? He asserts himself all over the place. He aggresses all over the place. Mm-hmm. No, he's not healthily assertive. But so speak to the fear a little bit more and what is going on to the emotionally immature man who doesn't know how to talk about feelings, and yet his wife has just ordered 6 things from Amazon, and now, bam, he only knows how to use a hammer.
Are you asking to talk more about the mindset, or are you asking what the woman needs to do in this situation to be able to protect herself?
We'll get to that. We'll get to what needs to happen. But just to try to understand what. So this is I'm already kind of setting the stage. In my mind, the way I see these men, most of these men that we're working with, they're emotionally immature. They don't know how to talk about feelings. They almost could never step up and say, I'm afraid. It is my fear. I feel insecure and frightened, but that's mine. I own it. I take they can't do that. So speak to that. Where are we going to find these men? Where do they reside emotionally? Not where literally, but what's going on in their heads?
I'll give an example. There's a gentleman in the Seattle area that does neurofeedback, a clinical psychologist. And I watched him work once where he sets up a brain scan and sends it off to a database in Copenhagen, I believe, to see how that person's brain is operating versus the peer group, similar education, similar career path. So we can learn what parts of the brain might be hyperactive or underactive. Yeah. And then be able to use all sorts of types of therapy to interact with the brain to bring it back into balance. One of my favorite stories in this regard is a woman who was convinced that someone was going to come into her house at night and cause her harm. So she got a concealed carry permit and a gun and was on guard all of the time, worried that someone was about to attack her. After a series of this kind of therapy using neurofeedback, she was able to go back into her same house and be at peace and realize that the story that she was making up was causing her fear, not the actual experience in reality. So I think that if we were to hook up some of these men's brains, we would see that they're literally not in their right mind to be thoughtful and considerate and compassionate. And so they can't respond as a healthy person would because they're literally not in balance.
You know, and as you say that, my natural response, and I hope everyone who's listening, I hope your natural response to some extent is to have compassion. So not that we would tolerate bad behavior, we don't. Not that we wouldn't set boundaries on bad behavior, we do. But Lee, you're talking about something that I experience with the men that I'm working with every day. Like they are not thinking clearly. I want to segue into that topic for a moment. Back to, you said that this man who feels threatened, did we agree that he's not likely to say, I feel threatened?
Right.
So, okay, so he's likely to, what's he likely to do? You used the word defend. So just to help everybody get inside of his mind a little bit, he feels some kind of fear, threat, probably not even related. I mean, it might be just kind of related to the current situation, might be largely related to his upbringing and a bunch of other things. So he feels threatened, can't say that, can't own it. And so now what do we see? What does she experience? She experiences, and I'd like you to speak to this a bit, Lee. I think she experiences his minimization. Not that big a deal. Blame shifting. You're the reason I'm doing this. Excuse making. I was forced to do this because of da-da-da-da-da-da. Playing the victim. You're upset? What do you think it's like being in my shoes? I had to see those 6 packages from Amazon come in the door when I know we've only got 2, etc., etc., etc. So now he's got this force field up, and you can't talk to him about this financial abuse. Yeah. So do you see that? Do you see what I've described there?
I do, and I'd like to share a story that I did with my parents, because sometimes you might not be able to appeal to emotion when somebody is triggered or overwhelmed, but you might be able to appeal to logic and reason. So we did this exercise because my father had a sense of financial lack. He was always worried because he had lost a bunch of money earlier in his life. And my mother spends a bit more freely than my dad. So he has an emotional response to spending, and especially to her spending. It's not necessarily related to their budget. So we created a budget, and we tracked their spending for 3 or 4 months. We looked at it compared to what they would imagine a healthy budget for their household would look like. And as it turned out, my mom could actually spend the way she was spending within their budget. So now when my father gets upset emotionally, she can say to him, I understand this is an emotional reaction for you, and I'm aware of it and trying to be thoughtful about it. But I want you to see that practically we can do this. Our budget shows that. A reasonable person would be able to come back down from the emotional reactivity or the defensiveness and be able to participate in a conversation that's about reason. Mm-hmm. So that's an exercise that we might do with people who are ripe for being able to still work together, but they don't actually know what the foothold is for the beginning of the work.
So you just added a component that is important for us to, as we're going to move, we're going to segue into where do we go from here. But I love the clause you just said, for the person who is ready to look at themselves in a way. So,
Yeah.
so that's a key part of our work. I mean, we ask ourselves, and we might even ask them in some kind of way, are you ready to look at your reaction here? Are you ready? Are you interested in why you have such a reaction to her doing da-da-da-da, whatever it is?
Mm-hmm.
And right there, the answer is going to tell you a ton about what your next move is, correct?
Yeah. Do we have a pathway forward to help these people, or are they really resistant and unable to see the reality of their situation more clearly? And this is where there was a video that I had seen years ago with Brene Brown. The topic was, are people doing the best that they can? But within that video, there was a small segment which was saying that the most compassionate and empathetic people are, in the research, also the most boundaried, because they understand how to protect themselves when it's time to protect themselves. And so we're not sitting here trying to advocate that women who are in financially abusive relationships just sit there and take it and try to be empathetic to their mate. There may actually be some really firm and fast boundaries that they need to create while being understanding and while being accepting that this is the best that he can do right now. But I need to do these things to safeguard myself.
Well, you just ventured into a topic I'd like to hear more about, Lee. So maybe this is a good segue into the path forward. What do we say to the woman who is being financially abused? That he may or may not be open to exploring his reaction. He may or may not be conversant to what is he really feeling. Let's assume for the moment that he's not very, very open, but maybe there's a bit of a crack. I mean, one can hope that there's a bit of a crack in the door here, that maybe she has said, look, I am really upset. She started to pull away from him, perhaps emotionally. I mean, there's a little topsy-turvy going on in the relationship. So most of the guys coming to us know that all is not well on the home front. So, but start to talk about what is the path forward with a situation like this? If a woman comes to you and she is feeling, actually, maybe you can also address: is this part of a deeper problem too?
I'll answer the second question first. In the way of how we do anything is how we do everything. So if there is an openness and willingness and collaboration around finances, it's probably showing up in other parts of the relationship too. So it's probably more likely a symptom than the root cause. But with these kinds of situations, you can start the healing in any one of the symptoms and work your way backwards, or you can start at the root cause. And so working on finances might be a really easy softball approach to get a couple to begin to work together in a healthy way that they haven't for a long time. And now to answer the first question, second, there's a continuum of where you might be able to work with somebody. And if they're too far to one end of the spectrum, and we're obviously not lawyers, so we can't give any kind of advice on what somebody needs to do legally, but every state has laws that are there to support and protect the partners in a marriage. If you have no access to money and your spouse is being incredibly controlling or manipulative around that, you may need to get help because you have a legal right to be protected. At the other end of the spectrum, both partners really want to work together. They absolutely are ready to show up. They just don't know how to do it together, maybe because, like we said at the beginning, they never had any financial education. So coming and sitting with somebody like me or you could be incredibly helpful to get them moving forward in a productive direction. So we need to assess where they are on the continuum to figure out, can we help, or are they so stuck? And I say they, really, mostly I mean the person who's abusing through finances. Are they so stuck that they literally can't come to the table and be open and willing to see their own behavior objectively?
How might she determine how stuck is he? Whether this is a path of, will he show up for counseling? Well, maybe that's even the answer. But well, go ahead. You give the answer.
You answered your own question. If you're in a healthy relationship, even if your spouse is struggling, and you say, I want to work with you in a more effective way, I've got some ideas, feel free to bring yours, let's try to figure it out together, and the person shows up, then that's the way to go forward.
Yes.
If you do everything that you can, you pull out all of the stops. I'm trying my best here. I'm at the end of my rope. I don't know what else to do. And they don't help, then they're not willing to help. At least at that moment, you're working with somebody who's not ready to do that kind of work.
And then what? So,
like I said a few minutes ago, if you're not, I've known you for a long time, you're not one who's quick to separate couples or, force separations or move towards things that are more permanent. But sometimes that has to happen just because there isn't enough safety for both partners, especially the one who's being abused, that they can be safe and they can regulate their nervous system and they actually can be healthy being themselves. So at the far end of the spectrum, if someone is unwilling to participate in what, remember we talked about, should be your healthiest partnership of your life, if they're unwilling to even participate, best to step back. However that looks, take some space, create some boundaries, and then let that time either show you that there's a different pathway forward or that there is just an impasse that you're going to need to work through in other ways.
I want to make sure that everybody gets what you just said, Lee, on the topic. And this podcast is not about separation, but you are correct. I will say this about the topic of separation. 10 years ago, I probably never even brought up the topic. Like, I don't think we got to even talk about that. 5 years ago, we can talk about that. 2 years ago, this needs to be part of the conversation. And now, currently, when we're talking about emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse and entrenched character traits, and, we started out this podcast, Lee, by saying, probably the majority of folks that are listening to this podcast, they've tried hey, what you're doing is hurtful to me. I want to talk to you about it. And they have been shut down. The man, out of fear that he could not talk about the emotional underdevelopment, the inability to even effectively problem solve, which you are superior at, I'm pretty good at. Many of these men, the topic of effective problem solving is not happening anyway. So if a woman is facing this kind of abuse, I do think the topic of taking space, the topic of boundaries, and by the way, boundaries, as you well know, you've written on the topic of boundaries. Boundaries have to have consequences, otherwise they're just complaints. So everybody needs to get really clear within themselves. But just speak to that a little bit more about what might taking space to think things over, to create, in my language, you've heard me say this many times, creating a bit of a crisis, perhaps even, rocking the boat, yes, and you take on some water, but walk us through with that, Lee. What might this woman do? She's tried to confront him. He's stonewalled her. He has not been willing to talk, to really collaborate. And so she is at her wit's end. And so what could name some different scenarios of what taking space might look like? And by the way, there's books out there on this topic, and there's some really good books on taking space to think things through. Walk us through that.
Well, we've been refining this internally at MRC. What does a separation look like? What are the rules of that? Why would somebody do that? What are the red flags that would cause you to begin to think about that? And so each case is different. I think safety, well-being, and support are probably the key things that define whether or not it's time to do that. If two people can't be together in a way that's healthy, and especially if there are children involved, that's probably the biggest problem that we see, where kids in their experience is being compromised by the friction in the marriage. So it doesn't have to look like anything in particular. It just has to work under the current circumstances for both people involved. And so it could be moving all the way towards separate households, or it could be a separation within the house. It could be anything as long as it works and the person in particular who's being abused feels safe under those guidelines. The thing that I want to say, sometimes we don't have lots of abusive people listening to these podcasts, especially if they're not ready for change. But I want to remind people the financial ramifications of a divorce are significant.
Mm-hmm.
If you think that your finances might be compromised a bit now because your partner is overspending based on how you like to run the budget, it is nothing like what it looks like when a household separates completely and now it's divided in half, and now there's two households to run, and all of the retirement accounts are separated as well. And it is the biggest destruction of finances and the accrual of wealth of almost anything that happens in a person's life. So if you're focused on finances truly, then you would want to have a healthy marriage, and you would want to work collaboratively with your spouse to ensure that that's the case. If that's the case, we can help you, because that's an easy place to start. If that's not the case, and that the financial abuse is really a symptom of some other things going on, it may be difficult to start there.
Underneath all of this, Lee, so, the cliche, there's got to be a breakdown before there's a breakthrough. So, systems, we know all about this. You know about systems, financial systems, business systems, and a marriage is a system, and a marriage and a family is a system. So there's got to be, for insight and change to happen, typically there has to be some kind of a breakdown, some kind of an intervention. In other words, you know the cliche, do what you've always done, get what you've always got. Or the other bumper sticker is do what you've always done and expect different results. And that's called crazy or insane. So, okay. So to you, to the woman who is being financially abused, to the man who has got an iron grip on, no, this is the way things are, an intervention is going to happen at some point. When we recommend a separation, when we recommend taking space, we're cognizant of the fact that there's already a fracture going on. This isn't like, all of a sudden, like, oh, I can't believe she's thinking about pulling away from me. Sir, she's been pulling away from you for a long time. This is nothing new. So anyway, if you want to mitigate against this fracture, because it is just what they're doing is not sustainable. So thoughts, any further thoughts about that, Lee, that this is a fracture that really needs to happen?
We've been talking about this also internally, which is for married couples stand up in front of their community and they make these vows. I promise to do this and that. And at no point during those vows do they say, I will stay with you even if you're financially abusive. It never happens because at the beginning, everybody's promising to be a good partner. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All we're trying to do here is bring them back to that moment and say,
love it.
This is actually the reason you came together. This is what you promised each other. The reason that there would be an intervention or a boundary or any change in the current dynamic is not for anything other than you strayed very far away from what you promised your partner. Nothing more than that.
I love that, Lee. That is, and we say that to this man. We say it to him. We say, look, we're not trying to hurt you. We as a company, we as people, and I'm confident I speak for you here, Lee. We're for you. We want the best here. We're not. I've been accused, when I when I recommend stepping away, a time apart, a separation. Like, how could you possibly recommend? I'm recommended because you've strayed too far, and this is not sustainable. So, financial abuse, emotional abuse, that a relationship cannot thrive under those conditions, and it will disintegrate. It's just a matter of time and a matter of how is it going to disintegrate. Closing thoughts.
One piece I want to add to that is the research around wealth and happiness seems to indicate that at somewhere around $60,000 or $80,000 a year, that's where happiness maxes out. Meaning you don't become significantly happier if you have $1 billion. So this idea, the Mr. Burns sitting on top of the hill counting his money, it doesn't make people happy. And we've not seen that in the work that we've done either. What makes people happy is when they feel that they're in a connected, supportive community in all of their relationships with their spouse, with their church members, with their kids, with their relatives. The money is just the thing that fuels all of the other stuff, but it's not the key component. And this is where people, I think, get misled. That if they can be happy, that generally the money works out fine. It doesn't work out fine if you're focused on the money.
Great point. So we're going to bring this podcast to a close, Lee, and I think you've done an incredible job at unpacking what does financial abuse look like, why does it occur, what are the roadblocks that one is likely to face when they try to change their situation. There's a balance that can be developed in a relationship that's a very unhealthy balance. It's like, man, they are locked in doing things the way they're doing them, and yet when we look closely, it's really not healthy. It's not really sustainable. Can you close with a word of hope about what can you as a coach offer to this person, to this woman who is looking for a life ring out of this situation, and what might they do?
I think it's a two-part process. I think if somebody comes, we can figure out together where on the continuum the couple is. Are they really at a place where there's nothing to do other than take space because the partner isn't really receptive or available? We can figure that out together. If we figure out that they are receptive and available, then we've got a lot of options at our disposal. And the example of the budget with my parents is just an example of how to take the emotional thing and bring it into a central place for discussion. We can do that together if both people are open to it. And if only one person's open to it, we can figure out how to create healthiness, space, and patience until the other person hopefully is ready. And because I've had so much experience in my own life and with other people around money, I feel really comfortable talking about money as if it's any other aspect of a relationship, only because it is.
Yeah.
Right? It is. It's a wedge in the pie, and I think it's integral. And I would welcome anybody who has friction there to seek me out if it feels like that's a place they want to start.
Okay. Hey, thank you for bringing clarity to this really challenging topic and challenging situation. But what you see with Lee Kaufman there, this balanced, emotionally balanced guy who approaches this topic like, hey, we can do this. That's how he approaches every situation. So again, thank you for bringing clarity and an element of confidence to this troubling topic.
I appreciate the conversation. It's been at a high level, and I relish these.
All right. Thank you, Lee.
Okay, thank you. Bye.